Heretical Visionary Sacraments amongst the Ecclesiastical Elite by Carl A.P. Ruck and Blaise Daniel Staples. Painters in the Renaissance were professional craftsmen and were expected to satisfy the wishes of their patrons. We are going to show you two masterpieces from the early 16th century which strongly suggest that certain very highly placed circles within the established Church of Rome were aware of and practiced secret visionary sacraments. The altarpiece that Grünewald painted during the years 1512 to 1516 while he was in residence at the Antonite Monastic Hospital in Isenheim in Alsace, now in the Musée d'Unterlinden of the city of Colmar, and second, Titian's Bacchanal of the Andrians, painted for the Duke Alfonso d'Este's Camerino, or study, a series of private rooms in his main estate at Ferrara, while the artist was in residence at the Duke's court during the years 1518 to 1524, now in the Prado, Madrid. Alfonso's brother was the Cardinal Ippolito, to whom the poet Ariosto dedicated his Orlando Furioso. The Isenheim Altarpiece. The Antonite order originated in 1080 when the relics of St. Anthony were brought to France from Constantinople, and the monks became a healing community when two noblemen founded a hospital in the village of Saint-Antoine de Viennois because of the miraculous recovery from ergotism, or St. Anthony's fire, experienced by pilgrims to the site through the saint's intervention. These communities multiplied. In around 1300, the one at Isenheim was established near Colmar. Their influence and prosperity increased through donations and offerings, so that two ruling members of the order were able to commission and finance a great number of works of art, including the altarpiece by Grünewald, whose actual name is not known, but he appears to have been a certain Matthias or Matthew, the painter. The Antonites were disbanded in 1780, and the monastery was taken over by the Knights of Malta. And after the French Revolution, the altarpiece was dismantled and stored in various places until its present location since the end of the Second World War. The altarpiece was designed to enshrine an earlier polychromic wooden sculptural group by Nicholas of Hagenau, depicting the Last Supper and the enthroned St. Anthony, the patron saint of mushroom gatherers and purveyors. And the altarpiece itself is a polyptych of 9 paintings arranged in 3 levels of presentation, with the innermost, which frames the sculptural group, opened for view only on the founding saint's feast day. It is here, in its most secret presentation, that the mystery suggested in the outer 2 presentations is revealed, in a paradisiacal forest scene with the psychoactive Amanita muscaria, or fly agaric, glowing at the base of a tree, something otherwise not particularly remarkable in this region of Alsace, where the fly agaric is so commonly a decorative motif that it has come to be termed the fairy tale mushroom. In its outermost presentation, which was never completely visible to the congregation because of the now lost frame and gilded sculptural top, which originally integrated the work into the architecture of the church and obscured it to those who were outside the altar area, the altarpiece depicted the crucified Christ, larger than the figures who flank him, and with all the graphic details of his tortured flesh, the thorns of the scourges sticking into the already festering wounds, and the sacred blood pouring from the gash in his side. The purpose of such gruesome depictions was to induce an empathetic identification of the viewer with the torment of the Redeemer. The patients at the monastic hospital would have found themselves in an unfortunately paradoxical blessed state to be suffering from the similar dermatological agony occasioned by their affliction. St. Anthony's fire causes a severe, painful, gangrenous skin eruption, also called the holy fire, with a club-like mummification of the extremities, together with delusional hallucinations and an uncontrollable convulsive twitching, which was interpreted as a fatal dancing sickness termed St. Vitus' dance, after the 3rd century Christian who was martyred as a child and invoked along with St. Anthony by those afflicted with the malady. In the scene below the crucifixion, the corpse of the dead Christ, with abscessed and bloated skin, is shown being placed in his tomb, which the faithful, of course, believed was only temporary while he awaited the resurrection. This scene remains on view for the 2nd level of the presentation, and only for the innermost third is it revealed that behind it is the carving of the 12 disciples at the Last Supper, which is the ritual ontology for the sacramental meal. On his right side, John the Baptist, with the River Jordan in the background, is bearing witness to the Messiah at the baptismal initiation, which was the beginning of his ministry. The crucifixion, of course, was its completion, and John can only be someone returned from the dead, since he was beheaded 4 years before Christ's death. The Latin quotation is from John's Gospel 3:3, Illum apportet crescere, me autem minui. He must grow greater while I diminish. It marks the transition from the last prophet of the Old Testament, which the Baptist holds in his hand, to the first of the New, and it occurred when John recognized Christ as the Lamb of God. It was a theme that John of Revelation would develop, and that became the foundation of a secret, more mystical tradition within Catholicism. At the Baptist's feet, the Lamb, holding the cross of the crucifixion, is shown pouring his blood into the chalice of the Eucharistic meal. This precious blood, which is the same as the blood pouring from Christ's wound, is magical and is meant to be drunk. A drawing of the 15th century Frater Vincentius Kowski, a monk of the Danzig order of preachers, depicted himself draining it directly from the wound of a Christ crucified as a tree of life, with an alchemical oven shown as a temple in the background, marked with the symbols for male iron, female copper, and an encircled dot, which is the sign for the final goal, the elixir of drinkable gold, and also a common motif for a mushroom. The oven temple itself also resembles a cluster of fungal caps. The inscription reads, "Now learn naturally and artfully to draw from this Catholic medicinal fountain of the living water and the oil of joy." A century later than Grünewald, the Spanish painter Francisco Ribalta depicted St. Francis in a swoon of ecstasy as he drank the blood directly from the wound. The saint was notorious for his empathetic union with the Savior, so much so that he received the stigmata of the wounded hands, so that we can be sure that the effect of the psychoactive mushroom was not unknown within the circles of the Church. St. Catherine of Genoa, who was a contemporary of Grünewald, according to her Latin biographer, employed ground agarics with the result that God, quote, infused such suavity and divine sweetness in her heart that both soul and body were so full as to make her unable to stand. On Christ's left, the Virgin faints into the arms of the evangelist John, who would become her protector, while the Magdalene falls to her knees in grief. Beside her, and balancing the lamb and chalice, is an exotic covered unguent jar, marked with enigmatic signs, which may be the artist's dating for the work to 1515. The unguent would be used to prepare Christ's corpse for the entombment depicted below this scene. The panel to the right of the central crucifixion portrays St. Anthony on a pedestal and holding the tau-shaped cross that is his attribute. Behind him is a window through which a demon can be glimpsed, about to break through for the saint's crisis of agony, a scene that will be depicted fully in the innermost presentation. The panel to the left is Saint Sebastian, also on a pedestal, and pierced with the arrows of his martyrdom. He is standing free from the column to which he was bound to serve as the human target for the Emperor Diocletian's archers. The model for the figure is believed to have been the painter himself. His initials, as a monogram, appear in the lower left-hand corner of the panel. In this matter of empathetic union with the Christ, it must have been an extraordinary ecstasy that Grünewald experienced as he imagined himself suffering the same agony as the Savior and the patients at the hospital. And the pedestals that link the paired figures indicate that through their suffering, the two saints achieved beatitude. Saint Sebastian was the first saint invoked against the plague in medieval times. Dating back to ancient belief, the plague was thought to be caused by poisoned arrows sent by an angry god. Like Apollo, Sebastian was seen as both the sender and the remover of the plagues. The two pedestaled saints were originally executed in grisaille, as imitated sculptures merging with the chapel's architecture, but then painted over with color, and both are placidly unconcerned by their torment. The crucifixion panel is hinged right and left and split down its center. When swung open like cupboard doors, it covers the panels of the two saints and reveals scenes painted on its other side, which now frame a new central panel. In this second level of presentation, the panel on the left is the Annunciation, and the one on the right is the Resurrection. The altarpiece was opened to this level at Christmas, Easter, and on all feasts of the Virgin. The opened book in front of Mary in the Annunciation is the text from the Old Testament, Isaiah 7:14. Ecce virgo concipiet et pariet filium et vocabitur nomen eius Emmanuel. Behold, a virgin will conceive and bear a son, and his name will be called Emmanuel. Above her is descending the Spirit in the form of a dove, and in the architectural vaulting of the chapel where the angel Gabriel has found her, appears the prophet Isaiah with his book in hand, again confirming the concordance between the New and Old Testaments. The central panel comprises a single scene, as is confirmed by the washtub that transects the split between the two segments of the hinged cupboard doors. But the sunny happiness of the Virgin with the Christ child in her enclosed rose garden on the right, with the angels in the distance bearing the good tidings of the Nativity to the shepherds on the hillside, and with a mountain monastery suggesting the New Jerusalem, yields to a gathering gloom above the concert of celestial angels on the left. The Christ child in Mary's arms is held in a tattered cloth as a sinister intimation of his future sacrifice, while he fumbles with the beads of his mother's rosary, a futile, mystical, apotropaic gesture to fend off his inevitable fate. Just above the prominent beatific cellist in the celestial orchestra on the left appears the sinister Lucifer, or Satan, with a peacock's crest, as he was before the fall, and still joining with his viol in the heavenly music. The hovering angels in the choir are remarkable for the glowing orange halos studded with a surround of amanitas, clearly delineated with both caps and stipes, which change to more ominous colors, like the face of Satan, as the angels who recede into the further darkness of the background obviously become what can only be recognized as demons. The mushrooms adorning the halos of these otherworldly beings, both benign and sinister, are so naively iconographic that they might easily be seen in Alsatian folk art, a notoriously tenacious medium that preserves even in our day a tradition of translating nature into the diminutive. One can scarcely walk through the towns of this region without encountering a miniature vignette of the red-capped mushrooms, spotted with the distinctive white scabby remains of the broken universal veil, peering from gardens, window boxes, sills, and bakers' showcases. A substratum of Druidism beneath Christianity, which spans much of Celtic Europe, persists to lesser or greater degrees today. How much more would its existence have been prevalent 500 years ago? These musicians, in addition to their halos decorated with an aureole of fly agarics, wear distinctive carbuncles, an obsolete term for rubies chosen here to emphasize that fly agarics are often metaphorically such tumors and the like. They wear them as rings, both as apotropaic emblems and as the philosopher's stone, or lapis Christi, the carbuncle being an alchemical common metaphor for the mushroom. Above in the baldachin appear a hirsute figure who is God the Father, who sent his Son down for the sacrifice, and a man coiffed with feathers, who is the executioner. Beneath them is the Virgin, already in heaven, with a golden orange halo, and wearing a crown of flames, an indication of her state of ecstasy, which results from the descent of the Holy Spirit. The apostles experienced this holy fire as they were filled with the Holy Spirit on Pentecost in Acts 2, verses 1 through 21, when they seemed to others as if drunken. And in Acts 19:4, Paul induced the same ecstasy as the baptismal ordination of new disciples. It would be some compensation for the victims of St. Anthony's holy fire to compare their own affliction to the Virgin's elevation to the fiery heaven because of the dove that descended upon her in the Annunciation, both a blessing and divine curse, as indicated by the darker auras of Lucifer's troop of angels. In the resurrection panel on the right, the risen Christ floats upward from his tomb, which is painted in its traditional colors of red and white, with almost his entire body encased in this same golden orange aura, which now even more noticeably resembles the glowing cap of the fly agaric, with his white legs and trailing white burial shroud suggesting the mushroom's stipe. In this panel, Grünewald depicts the resurrection unconventionally as the transfiguration and ascension, with Christ's supernaturally weightless and transubstantiated body in sharp contrast to the leaden, unconscious bodies of the soldiers left below, unsuccessfully guarding the tomb. To return our attention to the Heavenly Virgin with her crown of flames, she raises her hand in benediction. Directly below her hand, still here on earth, are the objects that she is blessing. The wash tub with the Holy Infant's diaper draped to dry. Imagine the sanctity of such a relic if by chance it had survived. Beside the tub is a piece of single-handled pottery, a cup like the Magdalene's exotic unguent jar in the crucifixion panel, painted with enigmatic markings that probably are meant to represent Hebrew letters. The first and last letters are authentic Hebrew. Shin, often used to protect Jewish residences, as the exposed letter of the mezuzah affixed to the doorpost, and the ayin, which is the first letter and first word of the phrase ayin hora, the Hebrew for evil eye. Like the Virgin's rosary, it is an apotropaic sign fending off the inevitable destiny of the Son of Man. The object in question is the infant's pari, his chamber pot, or vase de nuit, a relic even more sacred, had it survived, than the wash tub and nappy. Above them, the infant's sacred pea is displayed, like a monstrance, the golden elixir in a ewer of exotic design, traceable to a Persian original. The vase de nuit is an alchemical vessel. In Lamsprich's treatise on the philosopher's stone, De Lapide Philosophico, Frankfurt, 1625, which employs the Christian theme of the Holy Trinity, the alchemist, like many others, speaks in riddles whose solution lies in the transmutation of the fly agaric's psychoactive toxins into its purified metabolite in urine. This is the drinkable gold that is at the same time a pliant stone, the spiritual transcendence that is the goal of the alchemical work. The alchemists always loved to confuse their readers by insisting that the goal was actually something vile and common, nothing more than urine. As early as the middle of the second millennium BCE, a Mesopotamian alchemical tablet, after listing the metallic identities of various plants, deities, and parts of the body, concludes, "Let the initiated explain it to the initiated. He who has not been initiated must not read it." There were many founders cited for this art of alchemy, named as the science of the juice, Greek chemia, since the alchemists liked to inflate their ranks with the names of famous predecessors. But a lineage can be drawn from a certain Ostanes, a Persian magus or shaman, who accompanied Xerxes on his expedition against Greece and instructed the Greek Democritus, the founder of the atomic theory of nature, when he stayed at his father's house in Abdera. We can only imagine what they may have discussed, but the Achaemenid kings of Persia had the Iranian version of the Soma sacrament, called hauma, and they were said to drink urine for ecstasy. The Greeks and the Persians, in any case, were in constant contact. Alexander the Great traveled in the opposite direction on his conquest of the world, and in India he conversed with the naked sages. And Apollonius of Tyana, a contemporary of Christ and also recognized as a god, we are explicitly told by his biographer, on the evidence of an eyewitness, was initiated by these Brahmin sages into their ecstatic rite of Soma, the Vedic psychoactive plant god, amongst whose botanic identities, and probably its most ancient, is the fly agaric mushroom. The Haoma cult, with its initiatory Eucharist, became assimilated in the West as Mithraism, the dominant, exclusively male religion of the Roman Empire. And early Christianity was so similar that they easily supplanted the other by the simple conversion of the Emperor Constantine. Even though the Church Triumphant rewrote its early history, the psychoactive sacrament was repeatedly reintroduced from the East as Manichaeanism, with their special fondness for red mushrooms. As Theobald de Hogenlande, in his book on the difficulties of alchemy, Liber de Alchemiae Difficultibus, probably contemporary with Grünewald, explained it, quote, "This science transmits its worth by mixing false with the true, and it endeavors to transmit the work obscurely and to hide as much as possible. The drinking of urine is always the most embarrassing and strenuously denied or hidden aspect of the initiatory ecstasy. In Lamsbrick's Christianized allegory, the Father has separated himself from his only Son and entrusted him to a spiritual guide who takes him to a high mountain, the traditional habitat of the sacred plant. From there, the Son hears the Father's cry for help and returns. "Oh, my Son," cries the Father, "in your absence I was dead, but in your presence I will live again." He joyfully embraces the Son and then swallows him. We see him here in his bed, sweating, so that the oil and the right tincture of the philosophers flow from him, as he asks God to give him back his Son again. Beside his bed is the chamber pot. During his sleep, he is transformed first into a clear water, then into a good earthly empire. He has created his Son anew. The three are rejoined in the Trinity of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Another version of the Trinity, presented in Ulmanus's Buch der Heiligen Dreifaltigkeit of 1415, replaced the Spirit with the Virgin, for the Father and Son were not only one, but also the Mother, who was born in the Holy Spirit and had conceived in the Holy Spirit. The Son becomes the Spirit Mercury, the Father the solar Son, Sol, and the Mother the body, or Luna, the Moon. In Theophilus Zweigart's contemporary Mirror of the Rosicrucians, Speculum Rhodostaroticum, the alchemist is depicted at the spring with chamber pot in hand, a spoon in his other hand, since obviously he intends to drink it. The wash tub with drying nappy lies just beyond him. The spring is labeled as the source of knowledge, hinc sapientia, represented as the hermaphroditic homunculus, the divine Son, resulting from the conjunction of Sol and Luna, the alchemical sun and moon. In a tented pavilion atop the mountain, the alchemist, with God's aid, cum Deo, is performing the actual work, ergon, of spiritual transcendence, with the book of Holy Writ, while beneath him, in the womb retort of earth, growing like the mushroom, the alchemical stone or lapis is being prepared as the par ergon, or subsidiary work, labeled as by nature art, arta natura. It is this alchemical elixir that the ecstatic Virgin with the crown of flames is blessing in the second level of Grünewald's altarpiece, a liquid of immense curative powers and also the source of ultimate gnosis. In this central apotheosis, Mary has become identified with Sophia, the personification of knowledge. We can now understand her bizarre and somewhat demonic union with Satan in the enigmatic scene in heaven. Sophia and Satan were interpreted as the two S's, the two contrary serpents, male and female, entwined on the caduceus staff of Hermes, the Greek god, who with his Latin name Mercurius presides over the silvery poisonous metal, the hud argyrus, quicksilver, or silver water. He joins his name with Hermes Trismegistus, the mythical avatar of all who practiced the art of alchemy. His emerald tablet, the Tabula Smaragdina, was the Bible of the alchemists, posted on every laboratory wall, supposedly going back to the ancient Egyptian Thoth, but actually a forgery of the 6th to 8th century, which became known to the Christian world after the 14th century through Latin translations from the Arabic. Succinctly stated, it taught that the monad lurks in diversity. Quote, true, without doubt, certain, the below is as the above, and the above is as the below, to perform the wonders of the one. Its father is the sun, its mother the moon, the wind carries it in its belly, its nurse is the earth. We see him in Barrow or Bogarus's Besondere chemische Schriften, gathered and published in 1705, Hamburg, as he wades through the primordial waters, a poisonous panacea, as guide of the soul through the sevenfold stages of illumination, holding the royal orbs, surmounted by the crucifix. For easily he becomes Filius Noster, our Son, the Christ revealed at the Baptist's anointing, Matthew 3:17, "This is my Son, the beloved, in whom I am well pleased." When the huge cupboard doors were opened, splitting the scene of the celestial choir in the Rose Garden for the final and most restricted presentation on January 17th, the feast day of the hospital's founder, St. Anthony of Egypt, known as St. Anthony Abbot, patron, as we have mentioned, of mushroom hunters and purveyors, but also of grave diggers, the sculptural shrine is now revealed in central position, and the two flanking painted halves depict each a scene that is the antithesis of what was on its opposite side. On the other side of the Nativity, which is again the right side panel, is seen the horrific torment of the saint, while the other side of the celestial choir reveals the beatific visit of the saint to the hermit Paul in the desert. On this day, and only for an instant, was revealed the secret of his cult. The panels describe the two-edged sword of the Amanita Muscaria. In its vacillation between the sublime and the infernal, we encounter the paradox of all entheogens, their ability to transport the initiate into a state of rapture, and their equally horrific ability to plunge the unprepared into the chaos of the near-death experience, a realm peopled by the grotesque. The sphere in which Paul the Hermit dwells in the panel on the left is rarefied. In fact, so sacred is its space that Anthony was initially refused entry into it. According to the popularist Voragine's 13th century La Légende dorée, he had to beg admittance, saying that he would rather die than depart if Paul forbade him access to his enclave. It is the antithesis of the nightmare that Anthony has endured in the temptation panel on the right, where the celestial environment that flanks it and the Virgin's rose garden on its obverse side is turned upside down. The morsel of heaven Paul has been granted is perversely reflected in Anthony's Inferno, as if in the verso of a magical mirror. The scene is described in St. Athanasius's Life of Anthony. A torrent of demons assaults the saint in his hovel monastic retreat as God looks down, and affixed to a tree stump that is nurturing shelf fungi, medicinally useful parasites but of no use now, are posted the words, Ubi eras Jesu bone, ubi eras quare non affuisti, ut sanares vulnera mea. Where were you, good Jesus, where were you? Why weren't you here to heal my wounds? The lamentation can only evoke the pathos of Christ's own agonized cry on the cross, Matthew 21:46, Deus meus, ut quid de reliquisti me? My God, why hast thou forsaken me? The disease, St. Anthony's fire, is clearly indicated in the figure of the wretched figure-turned monster just below the tormented and delusional saint, clutching his breviary in a ragged sack, a creature whose bloated, ravaged body with oozing pustules and deformed stumpy limbs reminds us only too vividly of Christ's own corpse, lacerated by the flailings of the soldiers' scourges in the crucifixion panel and the entombment on the predella below it, which now displays the carving of the Eucharist meal of the Last Supper by an anonymous 15th century sculpture, Christ in the center holding the earthly globe with the crucifix atop it, and the 12 disciples with their emblems, amongst them Judas the betrayer. John holds his poisoned cup, to whose toxins he was immune. Grünewald conceived his masterpiece as a unity, however disparate its components may seem. The Christ story is narrated in a brevity which is almost modern, reduced to its essential elements from Annunciation to Resurrection. St. Anthony and his elevation serve as counterpoint, the mortal beatified through a cleansing by disease and ordeal through poison. The hermit Paul's forest sanctuary is the antithesis of the temptation, which was the ordeal that earned Anthony's admittance to his blessed state and his elevation to his own enshrinement in the central carving, where he is seen with his left hand resting on the book that is the rule of his monastic order, and flanked by the saints Jerome and Augustine. At his feet are donors offering on one side a cock and on the other pigs, an animal replete with mythological connections to fungi. He wanders through the forests with his Tao staff, scattering away the evil spirits who keep the good mushrooms out of human sight. The grotto is a fantasy landscape, painted with meticulous attention to the details of reality that compose it. Thus we are convinced of its existence. The plants in the foreground are all medicinal and drawn with a scientific exactitude that allows them all to be identified: plantain, ribwort, vervain, crowfoot, spelt, white dead nettle, germander, white clover, poppy, and cross gentian, all herbs commonly employed in dermatological ointments for treating the symptoms of ergotism, St. Anthony's fire. They are all included in the herbals of the Middle Ages, particularly the Hortus Saniatis, published in Mainz in 1457. The Anthonites were a healing brotherhood and were of necessity trained in the arts of herbalism, both in the cultivation of medicinal plants and the gathering of those like the mushrooms that defied cultivation, and in the administering of their benefits. It is only reasonable to assume that their botanical knowledge had been accumulated over centuries and from various sources, local and distant. In all probability, considering their geographic area of practice, the French-German-Swiss intersection, a strong foundation of Druidic knowledge underlay their doctoring. That they managed to escape inclusion into the papal rubric of a heresy, given that herbal knowledge and the use of drugs was always considered tantamount to witchcraft in the Middle Ages, was no doubt due to their impeccable lineage, at least from the viewpoint of Rome. They assumed the Augustinian rule in 1298, becoming part of the network of the order of Augustinian canons, and before this there had been a cult of St. Anthony among the Benedictines. Both these associations, and in particular the imprimatur of Augustine, afforded them a certain immunity from suspicion. The ever-vigilant Orthodox bishops ignored them during the eradication of the Albigensians, the Templars, and other less fortunate sects during the purge of France in the same period. This and the fact that they were obviously offering the best medical treatment available in their age, especially for a disease that mystified and tormented an already tormented population, the medieval peasantry. Grünewald may have used himself again as model for the portrayal of the hermit Paul, imagining himself as an ascetic old man dressed in palm-leaf clothing, presumably picked from the tree behind him. According to the legend, Paul died at the age of 117 after Anthony's departure. Opposite him for the visit sits St. Anthony, whose model was probably Guido Gersi, who commissioned the work, and whose coat of arms, or blason, appears on the side of the rock on which he is sitting, amidst the herbal display of the healing plants. His way to Paul's hermitage, according to the legend, was shown to him first by a centaur, the half-horse creature from pagan traditions, who is the great keeper of the knowledge of magical plants, and then by a wolf, an animal no less replete with herbal symbolism and antique lore. The models for the scene give it a special importance and authority. The artist and his patron, and as the two converse upon the subject of their miraculous food in the desert, the fact that Paul has been sustained by a daily ration of raven's bread, their hands point and frame the fly agaric, glowing at the end of a log. A doe rests in Paul's lap, and its mate, the stag, is seen in the distance, rounding the tree and about to graze on the mushroom framed by the two saints' hands. Another naturalistically rendered fly agaric may have originally been adjacent to it, but the suspicious object seems to have been perhaps intentionally obscured or cleaned away during the unfortunate and undocumented restoration conducted in Munich after the altarpiece had been removed there for safekeeping during World War I. The deer is an animal notorious for its attraction to the mushroom and the ecstasy induced by its toxins. Several saints experienced a vision of the crucified Christ spread between the antlers of the stag. In the upper left corner, we see the raven descending from a dead tree draped with moss and lichen, with the ration of holy bread in its beak. Today, it has a double ration in its beak. Raven's bread is a common metaphor for the fly agaric. Ravens were thought to lay their eggs through their beaks. Hence the bread egg is descriptive of a mushroom with folkloric names such as raven's morsel and raven's eye. Christ's apotheosis in the resurrection transfiguration panel culminates in a blinding sunrise of glory, the divine light of matter transformed. Gone are the horrors of earthly existence, reduced now only to stigmata that remind the worshipper of the blood of the Lamb. Likewise is the saint transformed. The agonized Anthony, bitten by reptiles. One of the symptoms of ergotism is formication, the feeling that ants are crawling on one's body, and mauled by miscreants, becomes the personification of contemplation, the perfection of monasticism. The tableau evokes divinity in its every detail. The manna-bearing raven, the palms that paved Christ's path into Jerusalem, the stag whose antlers bore the luminous vision of the crucified Christ to the likes of St. Eustace and others, the same stag who is linked by tradition with the fly agaric, grazing upon it and metabolizing its entheogenic properties in a distillate of muscimol in its urine, and an animal as well, wildly attracted to this same urine from a human who has ingested the mushroom. How better to fuse the sacred history of the saint, whose cult preserved and continued the traditions of generations of medical knowledge, with the mystery of Christ, than by revealing those profound traditions in a mystical garden. Speculation should never be considered incompatible with scholarship, much less an enemy of it. After all, it is through speculation that inquiry is initiated. Unfortunately, but inevitably, there will always remain unknowns and lacunae in historical knowledge. Such is the case with the exact prescriptions and rituals of the Antonite healing order. We know that they administered to the sick, particularly to those afflicted with St. Anthony's fire during its outbreaks, and we know they did so under the aegis of the Church, but we do not know exactly how or where medical practice intersected with religious ritual. Prayer and devotional devoir, along with a dietary regime, primarily of pig, were a fundamental part of the routine, supplemented by the drugs that they employed to alleviate the symptoms of the plague. But the plague itself still remained a mystery whose origins were believed to be supernatural and whose treatment required priestly intervention. A sacred medicine was obviously at the heart of the Antonite therapeutic cult. Given the supreme position accorded the sacraments and the sanctioned participation of the laymen within the Church in at least 6 of them, baptism, communion, confession, confirmation, matrimony, and extreme unction, the 7th, holy orders or ordination, obviously excluding all but the priesthood, it seems reasonable to suppose that in times of spiritual and physical crisis, the sacrament of extreme unction, the anointing of a person facing death, would take on a special significance. As the most solemn and terrifying of the rites of passage, the Church performs the final purificatory act that a human being undergoes. This anointment is a profound affirmation of faith, whose results literally determine the eternal fate of the believer's soul and life after death. Elsewhere we have examined the origin and importance of anointment in the early Church and pre-Christian sects of Judaism. The chrismation rituals remain constant throughout Church history, allowing for variations between Eastern Orthodox and Western branches of Christianity and expectable alterations of format over the course of time. And this constancy permits us to hypothesize that chrismation was always understood as a means of imparting sanctity to the recipient. It would only be natural, therefore, that in searching for a method to cure a petitioner-patient both in soul and body, that the medicaments would be added to the sacred oil to be used in the ultimate sacrament. It was known that the skin could absorb toxins, both beneficial and deleterious. Observation alone would inform the simplest peasant of that, even without the substantiation of medical tradition. Both religious history and the medical arts were sufficient sources of knowledge for a healing order to have access to the requisite science of how to treat an illness homeopathically. The application of amanita muscaria upon the person of the sufferer in the correct dosage and under the requisite circumstances would induce the vision of God that, if not beneficial to the body of the victim, would be deemed of inestimable value in the treatment of his soul. If there were a physical recovery as well, so much the better. It must be borne in mind that our knowledge of the cause of the plague is irrelevant. In the medieval universe, it was a spiritual visitation, such as that visited upon St. Anthony. It was a test of the soul, a means by which God intended to elevate the base metal to the alchemical golden sublime, and a religious healing order would conceive it its duty to ease the transition that was to them so obviously achieved only through an inhuman amount of anguish. Titian's Bacchanal of the Andrians. Between the years 1518 to 1524, the Duke Alfonso d'Este commissioned Titian to paint 3 scenes for his camerino, or study, studiolo, at his papal fiefdom estate in Ferrara. The Camerino d'Alabastro was one of a series of chambers on the Via Coperta, or covered way, a second-floor bridge that linked the castello to the palazzo, and the camerino was probably adjacent to the Duke's bedroom, and the rooms were in some sense secret for the private retreat of the Duke. From its windows the Dukes could look down at the marketplace to watch the pleasant sight of his merchants making money. The Duke was a great connoisseur of art, and was endeavoring to acquire a collection of works by the greatest masters of his day. He had even visited Michelangelo while he was painting the Sistine Chapel and begged in vain for a painting from his hand. In a letter to his sister Isabella d'Este from the court humanist Mario Agricola, dated 1513, claimed that Alfonso, quote, cared only for commissioning pictures and seeing antiquities. The chamber and adjoining rooms also contained pieces of ancient art or copies, a marble room with a mix of figures and reliefs adorned with vases and antique and modern figures, as his sister described it. And the Duke's intention was to recreate an ancient picture gallery. The theme of the chamber's decoration was classical scenes of ecstatic orgies. The project had begun with Giovanni Bellini's Feast of the Gods, completed in 1514, and Alfonso had commissioned the worship of Venus from Fra Bartolomeo and the Triumph of Bacchus from Raphael. But Bartolomeo died in 1517 without executing the commission, and Raphael, who had been paid in advance, had submitted no more than a drawing before his death in 1520. Titian was enlisted to supply the 2 paintings plus a third, and the Ferrarese court painter Dosso Dossi supplied a series of 11 oblong canvases to go along the upper wall as a frieze above the larger paintings, a bacchanal with Vulcan, now lost, and 10 scenes from Virgil's Aeneid depicting the foundation of Rome. These paintings were hung too high to be easily visible, but they provided the excuse for the Camerino as a place where the Renaissance prince might find restful diversion to prepare himself better for the labors and duties of governing. It was thought that such contemplative seclusion was beneficial to the body's well-being, and the Duke first conceived of the project while recovering from a serious fever. 100 years later, in the 1630s, Rubens made copies of many of Titian's paintings, including 2 from the Camerino, The Worship of Venus and the Bacchanal of the Andrians, now both in the National Museum, Stockholm. The Duke's collection of paintings was removed to Rome at the end of the century, actually stolen by the Cardinal Aldobrandini, and placed on display in the Papal Villa, where Rubens saw them on his 2 trips to that city in the first decade of the 17th century, but his copies were executed 30 years later from memory and probably on the basis of sketches made at the time. The publication of Giovanni Battista Podesta's engravings in 1636 may have spurred him to paint his copies. The 2 Camerino Titians were never offered for sale, but remained in the artist's possession, placed on facing walls in the vestibule of his house. One wonders if he understood what he was copying. Padovanino of Padua also made a copy of the Bacchanal, now in Bergamo. The paintings were so famous that they were also reproduced as printed engravings. Titian completed Raphael's Triumph of Bacchus, intended as the triumphant return of Bacchus from India, as his Bacchus and Ariadne, now in the National Gallery, London, after the worship of Venus, but before the Andrians. The scene is taken from Catullus's description of Ariadne's abandonment by Theseus on the island of Naxos, whereupon his revel troupe, or Thiasus, of satyrs and Nisaean Silines, arrived to escort her to the other world as his bride, wielding the dismembered joint of a bull calf, whose head is seen on the ground being dragged along by a rope. Together with them are 2 bacchants, or mermaids, playing timbrel and cymbals. At the end of the train there is a drunken Silene riding a calf with a man beside him blowing a Roman horn or tibia, followed by a dark-skinned male hauling a cask of wine on his shoulders. Catullus 64, verses 257 to 65, also Ovid Ars Amatoria 1, 525 to 66. Quote, "They are celebrating orgies," as the poem says, "that the uninitiated desire to hear in vain. Celebrant orgia, quae frustra cupiant audire profani." The subject was probably chosen by Heretical, the court classical scholar, and the painting is a complete visualization of the antique poem, an ekphrasis, as the technique is called, the ancient rhetorical exercise in visualizing a verbal description. The scene from Catullus's poem is actually part of a tapestry for the wedding couch. Bacchus promised Ariadne that she would be transported to the stars, and indeed her constellation is visible in the sky above her. The bronze urn beside Ariadne bears the artist's Latinized name Titianus, and may have been an object in the Camerino. The yelping lapdog was apparently a court pet, and the exotic cheetahs were studied from the Duke's menagerie. The figure, wreathed in snakes, is modeled on the Laocoon, the most famous antiquity unearthed in Titian's lifetime. The Duke probably had a cast of it in his collection. His sister owned 2 bronzes of the same subject for her own studiola in the d'Este estate at Mantua. The figure, however, is also an illustration of one of the verses in Catullus's poem, "Pars se torti serpentibus in King Gay bont, some girded themselves with writhing serpents. The flowers on the right in the foreground, an iris and a columbine, were chosen to reproduce the color of Ariadne's gown. The white flower below the goat boy satyr is the caper, probably meant to be an erudite pun upon him as he capers beside it. The god is extraordinary in that he appears actually to be flying, Walitaba Iacos, as he hurls himself from his chariot towards his beloved, who twists her body away from him. The subject for the other two paintings, the worship of Venus and the Bacchanal of the Andrians, was suggested by the Duke, who took them from descriptions in a book loaned him by his sister, a manuscript copy, now in the Bibliothèque Nationale, Paris, of an Italian translation of the Imagenes, or Eikones, as is its original Greek title, of the 3rd century Philostratus Jr. Isabella chided her brother for keeping the book for over 3 years. The family of the Philostratoi came originally from the Greek island of Lemnos, and Junior was the great-nephew of the first, of whose son, the one who wrote the life of Apollonius of Tyana, he was also the son-in-law. The author imagines himself walking around a villa in Naples as he describes the paintings hanging on the walls to a young boy in his company. Unlike the illustration of the Catullus poem, however, Titian depicted little of the scene described by Philostratus. The riverbank is not growing with thyrsoy like reeds. The revelers are not dancing on both sides of the river. There are no bacchantes, no drunken tritons scooping up the water in seashells and blowing it out their horns, as in Vigenère's engraving. Each year Bacchus returned to his island of Andros, and the earth is so charged with wine that it bursts forth in a stream, and the islanders drink it straight, without the customary Greek dilution with water, and celebrate a drunken revel amidst the god's troop of satyrs and silines. The god's boat does appear in the far distance, moored as it should be according to Philostratus in the harbor. In the far upper right is seen the aged river god, asleep beneath a fruiting vine on a bed of grape clusters, pouring out its stream. But if the stream flowing from him is wine, it is not this that the revelers are drinking, no. It is what spouts from the infant god peeing that is the source of the river's intoxicating potency. There is an erudite humor in the way that Titian has represented the rhetorical emphasis in his Greek source on the quality rather than the quantity of this river's flow. If you have water in mind, the quantity is not great. But if wine, it is a great river, yes, divine, for he who draws from it may well disdain both Nile and Danube, and may say of them that they also would be more highly esteemed if they were small, if their streams were like this one. But before looking more closely at the river's content, however, we should note that what first strikes the viewer's attention is the shocking nudity of the voluptuous unconscious female in the right foreground. Her beauty has been frequently praised. Vasari called her a sleeping nude woman of such beauty that she seems to be alive. When Rubens saw the painting, the cardinal had had her nudeness covered with an ivy or vine leaf, which was subsequently removed by a curator at the Prado when the painting went to Spain. And Rubens made it a sprig of henbane, hiasciamos, in his copy, an intoxicating visionary herb well known in witchcraft, thus providing a reason for her deep slumber. Even more shocking is the fact that she is the infant god's beloved Ariadne, despite the difference in their ages. Her name, in fact, is an anagram of Andriae, women of Andros. In its original placement in the Camerino, the Bacchus and Ariadne was hung on the wall to the left at right angles to the Andrians, with the adult god flying toward his beloved. When Rubens copied the painting, he replaced the aged river god with a simple shepherd playing his pipes on the hillside to his flock, and interpreted the nude female as the nymph of the river. The eroticism of Titian's painting is intensified by the fact that the two male youths dressed in yellow trousers with braided black stripes holding onto the tree on the left were probably court favorites of the Duke. And the pretty woman in the red dress who leans across to chat with her companion in the middle foreground while her bowl is being replenished was Titian's mistress. Tucked into the front of her chemise is a billet doux, a note, with Titian's signature, Titianus fecit. Titian made it, or perhaps Titian did her. There is often an element of highly refined pornography in great works of art. Titian has undressed the similarly unconscious female who appears in the same position in Bellini's Feast of the Gods, which was the first painting to be installed in the Camerino. The two paintings eventually were displayed side by side. The identification of the peeing infant as the god in the Bacchanal of the Andrians is confirmed by the fact that in Bellini's painting, Bacchus also is depicted as a child, drawing wine from a wooden barrel. We might compare Goya's two versions of the Maha, one clothed and the other disarmingly nude. The patron displayed the clothed version in his private chambers in front of the other, and could raise it to undress the woman for his guests. Bellini's Feast of the Gods originally was a feast of Thebans, but was reworked so that the Thebans became Olympian gods with their attributes: Mercury with Caduceus, Jupiter with his eagle, Cybele, Poseidon with trident, Ceres, and Apollo. At the same time, the necklines of the female figures were lowered to reveal more flesh. The event depicted is Priapus's attempt to seduce the nymph Lotus. He is shown with his characteristic oversized erection thrusting forward under his robe, about to undress the sleeping female. His hand is already on her dress, but the braying of the ass seen on the left disturbed her slumber, so that she pushed him away. The ass paid for its blunder by becoming an annual sacrifice to the Ithyphallic Priapic god. The Duke had the painting touched up by both Dossi and Titian to keep it up to date with the newer works in the room. Titian opened up the background sky. The nude female in the Andrians, in fact, is not totally nude. She has been undressed and lies unconscious on her opened robe. Before returning to the Bacchanal of the Andrians, let us pursue this theme of eroticism one step further by looking at Titian's recreation of another imaginary painting from the supposed Neapolitan villa. The Worship of Venus illustrates Philostratus Imagines 1:6, although the statue of the goddess on the pillar is Titian's invention, since her presence is only presumed in the literary description, and far off in the distance, quote, where the nymphs have established a shrine for her. The scene depicts a jumble of romping cupids picking apples, a fruit emblematic of Aphrodite Venus, flying up into the branches of the orchard since they have no need for ladders. The cupids are engaged in a wrestling match and the hunt for the hare, as in Philostratus's description. But let there be no doubt that the cute little babies are engaged in a sexual romp. As the narrator explains to his boyfriend lover in the Neapolitan gallery, quote, "It is a beautiful riddle. Come, let us see if perchance I can guess the painter's meaning. This is love, my boy, and yearning of one for the other. For the cupids who play ball with the apple are beginning to fall in love, and so the one kisses the apple before he throws it, and the other holds out his hands to catch it, evidently intending to kiss it in his turn if he catches it and then throw it back. But the pair of archers are confirming a love that is already present. In a word, the first pair in their play are intent on falling in love, while the second pair are shooting arrows that they may not cease from desire. In the middle far distance, the Cupids are engaged in a bacchanal dance. The two women beside the pedestaled statue in front of the sacred grotto, a maiden and a matron, are nymphs thanking the goddess for their romping babies. They offer the goddess a mirror and a votive plaque for her intervention in their love life. The goddess is copied from a statuette by Antico after the Belvedere Venus in gilt bronze, now in the Kunsthistorische Museum Vienna, which once belonged to Alfonso's sister Isabella, and the Duke may have owned a cast of the same figure. The red, white, and blue in the foreground represent the colors of the d'Este house. When Rubens reproduced this painting, he changed the homosexual nature of the baby's romp by making some of them female, with butterfly wings, as versions of Psyche, and he added the apparition of the goddess herself in the sky in a cart drawn by swans. So let us return to the peeing god in Titian's Bacchanal of the Andrians. It has been suggested that he is simply a homunculus, whereas the sleeping figure of the river god is actually Bacchus. But Bacchus is never depicted as an old man, whereas Tiepolo twice depicted a river god traditionally as such in his portrayals of the river Peneus, the father of Daphne, the unwilling lover of the god Apollo, an old bearded man with the urn from which his river flows. The sleeping old man on his bed of grapes, unconscious beneath the vine, is simply the river god, even if it be a river of wine. So how do we explain the peeing god? He could be the spirit of laughter, mentioned in the final words of Philostratus's description. Bacchus, quote, brings laughter and revel, two spirits most joyous and fond of the drinking bout, so that the river can with the greatest delight reap its harvest for him. A urinating child was a common Renaissance image of hilarity. But, as even Philostratus put it, these two spirits, laughter and revel, gelos and komos, allow us to harvest the river's intoxicating properties. But even if a peeing child was a common metaphor for hilarity, we should ask ourselves what is so funny about it? Or, better put, why is the peeing god emblematic of ecstatic bliss? It is true that the sleeping nude rests her head on an overturned golden urn like a river nymph, but there is a similarly overturned golden chalice beside the urinating child, so that the god and his beloved Ariadne are linked as sources of the river's intoxicating harvest. The overturned urn, as a symbol of a spring, may actually have originated on the island of Andros. That the two figures belong together is suggested by a comparison with Lorenzo Lotto's depiction of Venus and Cupid, Metropolitan Museum, New York, from around 1530. The figures are labeled, and Cupid pisses up and threw a wreath of laurel directly at his mother's genitals as a symbol of fecundity. Thus, the urinating child is allegorical for good fortune and fertility, with the urine analogous to male semen. Catullus used the same image of a child peeing on a woman's lap as a metaphor for sexual union. In 1499, there was published in Venice by the Aldine Press a bizarre illustrated book in Latin by a pseudonymous author who went by the name of Francesco Colonna, now identified as the Florentine architect Leon Battista Alberti. The Hypnerotomachia Polyphili, or erotic sleep battle of Polyphilus, a dreamlike manifesto in defense of humanism as well as female eroticism in the form of a barely decipherable stream of consciousness narrative as the protagonist, the lover of Pollia, pursues his beloved Pollia or many things. It contains two designs for fountains. In one, a sleeping nude nymph of the spring is uncovered by an ithyphallic satyr. In the other, two nymphs hold up a peeing boy labeled as Laughter. Just 13 years later, in 1512, a nude sleeping nymph was installed as part of the fountain in the Belvedere statue court of the Vatican. Alfonso, as the second husband of Lucretia Borgia, was the father of the Cardinal Ippolito II, who was declared a bishop at the age of 2, an archbishop at 10, and narrowly missed becoming pope. It was he who built the villa and water gardens at Tivoli, with fountains spouting from male and female human body parts. This urinating homunculus in alchemy became emblematic of the materia prima, both the initial darkness of chaos and the pliant red stone mined from the mountain that is the beginning of the alchemical work. Often the homunculus is depicted peeing into the alchemical furnace. In a 17th century compendium of earlier alchemical texts entitled Cabala Mineralis, the peeing homunculus is in an alchemical retort labeled as Mercurius homo genens, Mercury, the engendering being, standing on a single foot, which is a common metaphor for the little beings associated with the mushroom. He is supplying a pool of urine, which is being heated in the retort by the flame beneath, so that its vapors rise to condense on the mushroom-shaped lid, which makes the whole retort resemble the bulbous stipe and cap of a mushroom. The condensed liquid is being siphoned off into a second flask, where it is again subjected to heat, vaporizing around the caduceus of the god, who is guide of souls, labeled as Mercurius vivus saphorum, living Mercury of the sages, rising through the unstoppered top, escaping as the final transmutation into the fiery elixir. This transformation had begun in the alembic to the left of the peeing homunculus. This one is shaped like an egg and is labeled Mercurii germen hermaphroditum, hermaphroditic seed of Mercury, and it contains the winged Ouroboros, which is being rained upon to initiate the egg's expansion into its phalloid and then vulva-form manifestations. According to an alchemical treatise, the Philosophia Reformata of 1622, the hermaphrodite, the king and queen, lie dead and dormant in the earth until it quickens with the rain of heavenly dew. It is a royal water marriage closely connected with the natural act of thunder and lightning that traditionally engenders the fly agaric. The two other vessels to the right, in fact, could easily be described as phalloid and womb-like, respectively, from which is birthed the drink of the sages. As for the Ouroboros, the common alchemical image of the serpent supposedly eating its own tail as emblematic of constant death and regeneration, the term, which is usually interpreted as tail-eater, is more easily translated as urine-eater. The word for urine in Greek is ouron, whereas the tail is oura, leaving the connecting omicron in Ouroboros without explanation. Supposedly it derives from a version of ura as orus, but that leaves unexplained the initial u and the lack of a double rho. The urinating alchemical Filius Sapientiae, son of wisdom, or puer aeternus, immortal boy, or anthroparion, homunculus, or Filius Philosophorum, son of the philosophers, who was also the lapis philosophorum, philosopher's stone, producing the urina puerorum, boy's pee, which was also the aqua permanens, the abiding water, was assimilated into Christianity, and the child is now drunk as the wine of the Eucharist, emanating from Christ. Michelangelo painted his children's Bacchanal, commissioned by Tommasini Cavalieri, where the drinking vessel into which the boy urinates is filled simultaneously with wine, and the holy baptismal fount was positioned exactly below the drawing. Lorenzo Lotto, in the mid-15th century, used the same symbolism in his fresco for the Oratorio Suardi in the Trescore Balneario. Rubens misunderstood the cause of the river's magical ecstatic hilarity. In his copy, created of course from memory, The river turns into wine not where the god is peeing beside the river nymph Ariadne, both with their overturned golden urn and drinking cup, but only where a reveler downstream is scooping it up. To return now to Titian's painting, we should note that the painter has depicted events occurring in what we would call parallel universes. Velázquez depicted a similar scene in his Borrachos, where Bacchus and his attendant manifest themselves unseen amidst the drunken peasants. You will notice that none of the Andrians, that is to say the properly clothed men and women of the island, 3 women and 3 men, make eye contact or see the nude Ariadne, the peeing god, nor any of the nude, dark-skinned males serving the potion. The darkness of their skin is at least partially caused by the yellowing of the varnish and the poor condition of the painting. Nor is anyone aware of the drunken Silene guzzling from his earthenware pitcher on the far left, nor the bearded male carrying off an antique 4-handled Greco-Roman vase of the same drink. Such vases were just recently being recovered from Etruscan tombs and were much coveted by the Renaissance elite. Whereas the man who is scooping up the intoxicating river's water at the base of the tree on the left belongs to the world of the god and his goddess, since he is looking directly at the peeing child, well aware that it is sacred pee that he is gathering. The 2 women reclining by the riverbank are looking only at each other, and the one in the red dress holds up behind her a patera, or saucer-shaped vessel, unaware that it is being replenished with river water from a silver pitcher by the nude male arched over her. A patera is, strictly speaking, not a drinking vessel, but intended for pouring out a libation, an offering to a deity. There is a circular movement from the man scooping up the river to the man pouring out the pitcher to the patera, back down to the crystal wine glass beside the riverbank, beside the overturned golden chalice and the peeing god, and then back downstream to the man scooping it up. The more you drink, the more you pee. The nude man behind the woman with the patera has the crystal wine glass in front of him, as well as the silver platter of roasted fowl, and it is only he who directs our gaze upwards toward the exotic crystal pitcher held aloft like a monstrance by one of the dancers, half filled by the alchemical elixir, and still higher up above it toward the guinea fowl perched in the tree. The dancer holding the pitcher joins hands with the woman in the blue dress, and she holds the hand of the man with the wreath. The 3 are dancing round, with the other 2 males circling them, so that the crystal pitcher is at the vortex of the ecstatic revel. In the distance, in the open triangle framed by the dance, the patera, and the poured-out river water, is seen a man with a Greco-Roman urn and a large crystal or silver urn, and with a hound beside him. Another large crystal vial lies beside the antique urn. He is apparently the destination of the man, departing at the far left with his Greco-Roman vase. Rubens replaced him with a fisherman, but Titian's man is more like an alchemist. As for the fowl in the tree, which is eaten, roasted on the platter beside the glass of wine, which also is to be drunk, the alchemical transmutations in the retort culminate in the beautiful display of the peacock as depicted in the pseudonymous German alchemist Trismosine's treatise, first produced by the Nuremberg book painting workshop of Nicolaus Glockendon in 1535. Venus and Cupid appear in the sky above, bringing sensual pleasure reflected in the vignettes of country revelry. In Philostratus's Imagines, the Andrians are singing the praises of this miraculous river. Quote, "This is what you should imagine you hear, and what some of them really are singing, although their voices are thick with wine." In Titian's painting, the words and melody of the song that the revelers are singing lies on the bank of the god's stream of intoxicating urine. The 2 women reclining on the riverbank each hold recorders, and there is another one lying beside the peeing god. The music is a canon, or round, and is labeled as such, composed by Willart of Flanders, who had just recently entered the music-loving Duke's entourage. Qui boit et ne reboit, il ne sait que boire soit, which is Old French for who drinks and doesn't re-drink, i.e. drink it again, he knows not what drinking is. In this masterpiece of Renaissance sophistry, the painting is actually part of the musical notation, indicating that the four voices of the canon are to enter each at a progressively higher tone. For, as is the common metaphor, even at this early date, the more you drink, the higher you get. The painting also assumes the ancient commonplace that drunkenness is a way to knowledge, in vino veritas, especially true when the drink is the alchemical elixir. The musical notation is oriented for the viewpoint of the revelers, hence the viewer sees it upside down and backward, but that too is part of the compositional puzzle, for half of the consortive singers would sing it as the mirror of the other voices, eventually converging at the 15th to 17th measure of the 33-measure canon. They cross as a chiasma at its midpoint to produce the musical equivalent of the Greek letter Chi, the initial of Christ's name. A similar Chi lies hidden in the final visual puzzle or rebus of the alchemical Mutus Liber, silent book, as the putrefying remains of Hercules, who has completed the labors of the alchemist, rises transcendently to the celestial realm. Like the urine of the river stream, the revelers dip again and again into the ever-returning words of the canon. The fifth major painting of the Camerino, Dossodossy's Bacchanal with Vulcan, similarly had a musical theme, involving Pythagoras' discovery of the musical octave by hearing the sound of Vulcan's hammers in his smithy. Pythagoras was able to reproduce the same intervals by hanging weights on strings. For Pythagoras, musical relationships were the basic structure of the universe. Sheets of music were scattered on the anvil, and again it was a canon, but the riddle has not been deciphered.